Hey everyone, Dr. Eric here from Adio Chiropractic. So I have a special guest, Jamie from Like a Dream.
Yes.
So thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, thanks for having me.
No problem. Today what we're going to talk about is sleep and sleep habits when it comes to our kids. So she's come up with 4 foundations to healthy sleep. So we're going to talk about different things, but what I want to do before we get into that is just have Jamie talk a little bit about, herself, and then we'll get into everything on the 4 foundations.
Yes. So I am a certified sleep consultant, certified through the Family Sleep Institute. It was a 4-month certification program where we had weekly classes. We also had research projects we had to complete. We had assignments due, homework every week, and then we also had 3 pro bono cases we had to do that was followed by staff to make sure we were appropriately guiding families before they kind of sent us out on our own. I completed all of that in January of 2017. So this January will be 3 years since I got that certification and started this business. Most of my families are local. I probably do about 10% virtually from afar, and then most of my local families do choose what we have as an in-home consultation. So this is where I actually go to the family's house. I get to meet the babies or the children, which really helps with kind of guiding families on what I'm seeing as far as their personality, their temperament, things like that. If we have like a younger baby that may be having potential reflux, things like that, I can kind of see what I'm seeing from my perspective of if I think we need to modify things or vice, or if I think, oh no, it looks pretty good, like I think we'll be good. We always get doctor's blessing to move forward with things, like if we have medical things going on, if we have, if we're talking about dropping night feedings for younger babies, all of those things. But so that's kind of what it looks like. I basically just work with families. We talk through these 4 foundations, which is kind of where this talk is coming from, because I tell families that sleep is a puzzle. So you can't just change one thing and hope that it will completely turn sleep around. We don't have magic light switches.
Yes.
But it's one of those things that if we can put all of these pieces in play and take out the guesswork, because all that guesswork happens at 2:30 in the morning when your child is crying for our younger babies, and then when our toddlers are protesting at bedtime and asking for one more book or another drink of water, those are times that we second guess ourselves and we kind of fall out of what our expectation is. And so it kind of just helps bring that all into a black and white thing. Here's what we do in each situation, and then I just kind of walk families through it as they do that. And if there's things we need to modify schedule-wise, or the child's not responding as we would anticipate, things like that, and that's kind of where I come in and kind of help coach them through that. And I think that as we talked previously, when we were able to meet and kind of get to know each other, that I think that's a good time that we could talk about too, the chiropractic side.
Yes.
So if things aren't going as we would anticipate, and I have a family that comes to me and we're 4 or 5 days in and aren't seeing any changes, okay, maybe there's something else we need to look at. Maybe there's something in the nervous system going on, things like that. So that's kind of where I'm able to provide that input versus just, oh, I read this book and this exact situation isn't working for me. Now I feel lost and I don't know what to do. And so it's kind of that personalized guidance too.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's so many different components, and it's just like, taking things and, looking at different things, like, with what we're going to talk about, there's so many different things here, but it's like, if this isn't working, then, or we're seeing some improvement, but we're not doing much. Like you mentioned, is there something on the nervous system aspect, the neurological component that's going on that is really preventing them from just, having that big transition?
Yes.
And that's working together with other people that also have different expertise in different things.
Absolutely.
So reason that I wanted to really talk about this topic is because that when we talk about sleep is one of the biggest things that just in general may not be their big push of why they're coming into the office, but kids' sleep is impacted, and it's maybe that they struggle to get to sleep, or maybe they struggle to stay asleep, or it's just that they constantly have to be like, they always are coming to your bed because that's where what they're used to, and all these things. So it's like sleep is so important for just the overall healing aspect of our body, and if we're not doing it, or our kids aren't doing it, it's going to impact them, not just short term, but it's going to impact them long term too. So let's get into the 4 foundations of healthy sleep. So the first one is you talk about is sleep environment. So let's talk about that.
Yes. Sleep environment, I like to start with this because a lot of times sleep environment is that thing where I'll have a parent come to me and be like, oh, I put up blackout curtains and it didn't help. Or I thought maybe he was cold, so I gave him a blanket and that didn't help. Sleep environment is such an important piece of that puzzle that it is really important to make sure we're setting up a place that is conducive to sleep. But at the same time, it's not a magic cure-all. But it is one piece of the puzzle. So I always come to my families and say, these are the things we need to have in place. We need to have your room dark, even for naps. And so many times, that's like my #1 question about sleep environment. Well, don't I need to get them used to sleeping in different places? Or what if we go on a trip and they won't be able to sleep? Well, for most of my families, a vast majority of the sleep happens at home. So why wouldn't we set a conducive environment for where they are 90 to 95% of the time, or even, children that are in childcare kind of things? Well, they're used to that environment. So when they're not there, they're at home. And so how can we set up an environment that they are encouraged and their body is prepared for sleep? As most people know, sleep is driven by the daylight, right? So if we can kind of reduce that input and reduce noise input, things like that, then the child is able to really just fall into sleep and sleep well. So pitch dark room, like we want to hold your hand in front of your face. If you can see your fingers, it's too light. So we want it like a cave. The second one is white noise. So there's household sounds going on. Babies, people in general, just don't sleep as deeply during the day because it's daytime. Our bodies are not in that kind of really deep restorative rhythm, but they need it. And so if we can kind of drown out that background noise, maybe the trucks that go by or the things that mom's doing while the baby's napping, whatever, that is also great. We want strict white noise though. If we turn on something that has like lullabies, or a lot of the sound machines have the ocean waves that you hear the ocean coming in and out, those kind of things can actually be stimulating because it's tuning their ears and their brain in to hear the variations in sound. So we really want something that is just strict white noise. We don't want variations in the sound. And then also a great room temperature, and the general recommendation is 68 to 72 degrees. I always tell my families, if your child looks comfortable, if you change them and they're not sweating, or their trunk is not cold whenever you change them, they're probably fine. You can kind of watch their body positioning as well. For instance, my almost 2-year-old, I always know when he's cold because he sleeps on his belly and he will tuck everything under. And so if he's doing that, I'm like, he's probably cold. And so you can kind of watch that too. Now we have monitors that are so easy to check on our kids when they're sleeping. And so, but generally 68 to 72 degrees is a pretty safe place. Really those are kind of the big things. You don't want anything distracting. So like no crib mobiles, those little aquariums that are popular on cribs. We don't want anything like that because we want our babies, our children to know when you're placed into bed, the expectation is it's a sleep time coming. So we don't want to encourage them to be playing or stimulated. We want to encourage them to be in a restful, peaceful place. And then finally, just kind of always the reminder for our babies that are a year under to follow the AAP guidelines. So we don't want any objects in the crib. We don't want any blankets, loose articles, firm sleeping surface, just the fitted sheet. We need to not use swaddles once the baby hits about 3 months old, they're saying now. Because usually around then, 3 to 4 months, we're starting to see the rolling, and that's when it gets unsafe. But really just kind of following those guidelines and then kind of maximizing that sleep environment is just setting the stage for all of the other foundations to come into play because we've got that set.
So with kind of the thing with the music, or just with the sounds and that stuff. Can't think of the name, but so those things that, you know, hook up.
Yeah, the mobiles.
The mobiles.
Mm-hmm.
So those aren't a big thing you recommend?
I don't recommend those,
Yeah.
because what it can do, especially for our younger babies, is they're laying there, they're staring at it, you know, and it sounds like one of those things. It's like, oh, well, it's nice. Like, even if he's not sleeping, he's got something to look at.
Yeah.
We want him to be sleeping. So I actually had a recent family that I was working with, and they put the mobile over the diaper changing station. And I was like, well, I don't know why I never thought about that, but that's a great place to put it. They're distracted while you're changing the diapers. They're not sticking their hands in places you don't want them to. So that's a great alternative if you get one at a baby shower or something and you want to use it. But I would not recommend it in the sleep area, because it can be stimulating and distracting, which is not our goal.
Yeah. Which, you know, honestly, I probably, you know, looking at it, I'll say that, you know, we have ours, you know, we don't use it anymore, but you know, that wasn't something that we really thought about. But I guarantee there's probably a lot of parents out there that still use one.
So many
times. Because they're so popular, and they tend to be one of the many gifts that they get at baby showers. So
yeah, and that's one reason why when I do these home visits for families, one thing that's included is in kind of that I don't do virtually is to go actually in their room. So I go in there and check how dark it is. I check the sound on the sound machine. And I check for things like that they may not think to tell me. And then I see it, and I'm like, oh, yep, this is something we need to remove or change that, like you said, you wouldn't have even thought about it. But, and again, it's not, things like that are probably not a make or break.
Yeah.
But again, if we're going to get this set, if we're going to put all of these changes in place and make sure we are setting our child up for success, that's one key that we can just easily take care of. Yeah.
I totally agree with that. So let's move to the second foundation, which is pre-sleep routines.
Yes, these are huge. So you know, any parent probably hears the term kids thrive on routine, right? If you do the same thing. So even if, you know, you have a child that goes to childcare and it's like, okay, we always do our little 2 kisses and whatever when we leave, or whatever that looks like. Kids really are helped by having pre-sleep routines. And so we like to do something similar for naps that we do for nights. Naps are just a little shorter. So at nighttime, it may include a bath. It may include reading a few more books than you would to put them down for a nap. But basically, the goal is to do the same thing in the same order every time they go to bed. So just like we were talking about how we're setting up the sleep environment so the child knows, okay, I'm in bed, I'm expected to sleep. Yeah. This pre-sleep routine is the same idea. They know when this, and this happens, the next thing that comes is sleep. So they're not just, you know, every day is different and they're just being placed into their crib at random times and they don't really know what's going on. It's, oh, well, this, and this happens. I always lay down, take a nap, or I go to bed. So really common for bedtime routines is something like if we did a bath, and then if we're still having bottles, a bottle, and then pajamas, maybe a book or 2 or a song. And then we always do, you turn on the sound machine, place the child in bed, turn off the light, and walk out. It's always the same order every time. They're not surprised. For our older kids, a lot of times that includes maybe some extra time spent. So that may be we talk through our day, like we sit and snuggle in bed together and talk about our day. That's fine, as long as we're not snuggling them to sleep, right? So, you know, that's more kind of a connection time that lasts a little bit longer the older our kids get, but it's still the same idea. If you have a 3-year-old that knows he gets 2 books at bedtime and then they start asking for the other one, it's like, no, we stick to that routine and we have these 2 books and we know, because then those stall tactics come in. And so having that consistency really sets them up well because they know what's coming next. So nap time may look a little different. It may just be a diaper change and a quick song, and then we do sound machine on, into crib, lights out. But it's still the same thing every time. And really, you know, what I talk to my families a lot about is these social cues, especially for our younger babies that are not verbal, things like that. They are picking up on what we're doing and what that means for what's coming next for them. So this is all just a cue for them to sleep, but we don't use routines as a means to sleep. Usually that means feeding to sleep, nursing or a bottle, or bouncing or rocking to sleep. Those are kind of our 2 big ones that it's like, well, part of our routine is I rock him to sleep. And we'll get to that later.
Yes.
That's another foundation as far as how they fall asleep. But, routines, I always say they're a cue for sleep, not a means to sleep. And it's really, really beneficial for these kids to kind of know what's coming next.
Yeah. And I would say, sleep routine is definitely very important. And that's something that we definitely do in our house. It's kind of one of those that, either my wife or I will put him to sleep, but when we go downstairs, it's like we change his diaper, then we read a book.
Yep.
And there's been times where he's tried to reach for a second book, and we say no, because it's just one book before. And then we'll have him turn off the light, and then we'll pray, and then after we're done praying, he just goes and he points to things. But it's even now, that's what he does now, but even before, that's kind of what we did.
Yes.
We read a book to him. Obviously now he can flip through it, but it's that same routine, and he is used to that.
Exactly.
And it's really helped us. And I know routines can be a struggle sometimes for some parents, but it's just that consistency and sticking with it.
Yes.
And, they're gonna some days fight that, and it's really not trying to break that habit.
Exactly.
So,
we know that kids thrive on routines, but they also thrive on having boundaries and knowing where those are.
Yeah.
That's their job to push those boundaries, but it's our job to maintain it, because that's what makes them feel safe and secure. And when we're thinking about our kids in bed and we're not there, as a parent, it's like, I want to make sure they feel secure, they feel comfortable. But we're setting that by being consistent with them. If we're inconsistent, if we come in and out all the time, if we do, give in to those stall tactics, things like that, that's almost creating an insecurity for them, because they're like, well, where is my limit? Where, why are we responding differently based on what I'm saying? They want to know the parent is the parent.
Yes.
And so the more you can stay consistent with that, you're actually setting a really secure environment for them, where they can be safe and know their bed is a safe place, and they're, there's nothing to be worried about, or there's nothing to be, to feel like they need you for, because you've set that up as a safe place for them.
Yeah. And like what you said, they need to know that you're the parent.
Yes.
Because, the kids are going to want to try to take advantage.
It's their job.
But it's one of those of you at the end of the day, who's the parent on it? You got to have that control over them. Otherwise, just like anything, if you kind of back down, somebody's going to take advantage. In this situation, the kid's going to take advantage because that's what they're going.
That's their tendency.
Yes.
And then then you lose out on sleep, and it all kind of cascades from there.
Yeah, exactly. So, so getting into third foundation, which is the daily routines and schedules.
Yes. So I previously talked about pre-sleep routines. So these are specifically things we do before nap or before bedtime.
Yeah.
There's also daily routines, right? Even as adults, we get up and we tend to, do the same thing in the same order every day. Our kids also need that and will thrive off of that. And so for the most part with my families, if we're 6 months and younger, I tend to follow more of a routine for the day. We don't really do a lot of following a schedule per se. And that's because the way sleep develops in our young children, their daytime patterns don't actually solidify until they're about 5-6 months old. Okay. So even if we set all these healthy foundations, they're able to put themselves to sleep, all these things, sometimes you still may just have a little inconsistent day because their body's not quite ready to take predictable naps at the same time every day. And so these babies, we tend to follow routines. So we just kind of make sure we don't keep them awake too long, make sure that they are going down at regular intervals for naps and not getting overtired. We make sure they're getting fed on regular intervals, so that way we don't have a hunger issue, and it just helps set their body up. So if we can kind of set their body and their metabolism and their routines as they develop biologically, they'll be able to kind of fall into a more consistent schedule. And then once we hit about 6 months and greater, we kind of work more on a flexible schedule. So there's rough times of the day that kids tend to sleep better. It's based on circadian rhythms, the sun, hormones, all of those things. And so we kind of time our naps roughly based on the clock. And then we use a 30-minute window to be we're aiming for this time, but if he's a little tired, a little sooner, a little later, we can kind of flex within that. So it's not a hard and fast thing, but it just helps set the guideline for the day. And so we really follow a routine at most ages of, we wake up and we eat, then we take a nap and then we eat, then we have playtime, and then we, there's kind of this routine for the day. And so the big thing about routines for our babies that are still on bottles is making sure that they eat when they wake up and not right before a nap. That may be a new thing for some families, because a lot of times, what do? We give them a bottle, they fall asleep, we try to put them into bed, and it works sometimes and it doesn't work other times. That's foundation number 4. So all of this stuff is kind of setting us up for the 4th foundation of falling asleep independently on our own. So this is a component of that. So we want to make sure that we don't feed to sleep. So therefore we kind of shift it. And also, especially for our really young babies, if we feed them as they're falling asleep, they're probably going to fall asleep before they get a full belly, because it's sleep, inducing. Yeah. And so they end up waking earlier because they're hungry, because they didn't get a full tummy.
That's true.
They're not awake enough to take a full feeding. And so especially, you can even start this from the day you come home from the hospital. Every time they wake up and they're ready to eat, try to keep them awake the whole time until they're actively done eating, versus letting them just kind of sleep and eat sporadically throughout the day. It really sets a good rhythm for them. So that's kind of a big thing as far as routines go for my younger babies, is that we feed upon waking, have an awake time. For our little bitty ones, that's like long enough to change their diaper and put them back down. But as they get older, you'll see that awake time stretch out, and that's when they play, and then they go down, and then we start over. And then, as they enter the toddler years and we have solids, we follow that routine that adults have. We have breakfast, a midday snack, lunch, mid-afternoon snack, and dinner, and they kind of nap on either side of that. So in this setting, it's a little bit difficult to really dive into what those schedules and those routines look like. And it is a little bit based on every family. So when I work with a family, it may be we're working around daycare drop-offs, or we're working around what time dad gets home from work, or various things. So there's some intricacies there that we do have to navigate. But for the most part, kind of if you think with our young babies, 6 months and below, if we can eat, be awake, sleep, and just do that all day. And then our older babies, if we can kind of work on that morning nap, an afternoon nap, and an evening cat nap, if they're still needing that, then that's a really good place to start.
Yeah. And it's just one of those too, that it's, each kid is going to be like different families, different depending on situations or what's going on, like with work and that stuff. But like, even with 2 kids, like, the one you had might have been different than the second one, going the same. You may have to modify these things like for each kid too.
Yes.
Onto it, because each kid is not the same.
I feel like, as I mentioned, we're coming up on my 3-year anniversary doing this. In that time, I started my certification when my oldest was 6 or 7 months old. And I now have 2, and I have a 3rd on the way. So I feel like with every child that comes, I'm learning more and more what my families are going through.
Yes.
And yes, every kid really is different. My second was a completely different experience than my first. With we had reflux issues, we had food intolerance issues that lasted a really long time, and so it's one of those things that there is a lot to navigate when you have 2 kids. And sometimes it's a matter of, well, do we need to stagger bedtimes? Do we need to keep them together? Can mom take one, dad take the other, or is someone not home and we have to do? There's a lot of kind of individualization that does come in. But there's also those big things, like those typical nap times, those typical bedtimes. One of the biggest things that I see is kids are going to bed too late. Today's society is just busy. They get out of school. For our older kids, and they have all these activities and homework. For our younger kids, it's just, they're flexible. They'll just come along and do what we do, or we want to make sure we see dad before he gets home from work, or even mom. Sometimes I have dual working families that no one gets home till 6:30, and here I am saying, okay, you basically got to get home and get them in bed, and so that's really hard sometimes. But we need to respect the child's need. And children do tend to have kind of these like internally driven times that they naturally get tired and they naturally wake in the morning. Some kids really are early birds. Like, I have a son that he's dying if he's not in bed by 6:30, and he's up every day at 6 or 6:30. And I am not a morning person, but we just have to make it work. And then there's other kids that tend to fall on the later end, and they'll go to bed at 7:38 and get up at 7:38, which is fine if that works for them. But we want to make sure we're not pushing our kids beyond what they're trying to tell us. If your child is really cranky at 4 or 5 in the evening, that's a really good sign that they're not getting enough sleep, and we need to do an earlier bedtime. And so usually I hardly ever recommend a family put a child to bed after 8 o'clock. And usually that means we want to be in bed asleep by 8. Right. Yeah. And then, you know, like I said, a wake up anywhere from 6 to 8 in the morning is pretty common. Yeah. It just depends on the child and family schedule. Maybe you need to get up at 6 to get out the door on time. Exactly. So they'll adapt to that as well. But, and you know, but a lot of times, and I know, I think you've mentioned before, you see this in your kids here in the clinic, that, you know, it's really hard to go to bed, and it's really hard for them to wind down and to kind of be able to calm their bodies. And I think there's multiple components to that. Yes. Basically, if we do a bedtime that's too late, what we do is there's kind of this think of it like a wave. Like there's a cresting wave of optimal time to fall asleep. And if we crest that wave and we miss it and come off on the other side, they are what we call overtired. That's when we see kids that get hyperactive. They get that second wind. What's happening is their body is being flooded with awake hormones because they kind of missed that chance to go to sleep. So now their body's like, okay, we got to find a way to stay awake, and it's just being flooded. And that's why we see that hyperactivity in the evening, and you think your child's fine. Like, oh, they're great, they're playing, they're happy. Like, no, they're just really tired, and their body's trying to stay awake. And that just makes the whole process so much harder. It's harder for them to relax and calm their bodies if we're on technology at night. Yes. That is another big one. And, you know, I think we all get it as parents at night. It's like, okay, just if it'll help you just be calm for a little while, let's turn it on. But I usually recommend once we hit dinner time that any screens go off. So whether that's iPads, computers, TV, any of that, we need roughly 2 hours before bed that we're not having that. There's a lot of stuff coming out there even about adults that stay in bed and are on our phones or watching Netflix, and they have those blue light blocking glasses now, which unfortunately, you know, I don't think our kids are going to be too fond of. So we just kind of keep the screens off, and that just becomes a family time and a connection time. So what, you know, for a lot of families, it looks like, okay, we do dinner and then we may do a bath and do some quiet toys, and that's a really great time to connect with our kids, so that again you're creating that safety and security for them when they go to bed, because you've had that connection time versus being disconnected the whole time, and then all they're wanting is for you to snuggle because they feel like they haven't really connected with you. And technology is one way that happens a lot. And so just if we just say, okay, like if you need it, if you know, mom or dad, whoever is cooking and the other one's not home and we need 20 minutes to make dinner, that's fine to have it on. But maybe once dinner starts, there's no more technology for the night. That is a big one. And then I think, like we mentioned earlier, if we're seeing that all of these things are in place and we're being consistent and we're setting the environment on all these things, and we're still like, they're just having a really hard time winding down, maybe that's where some of that nervous system comes in. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what that might actually look like in your child, when we can kind of determine the difference between this is a behavioral thing where they are kind of pushing those boundaries versus no, like they physically cannot wind their bodies down.
Yes, and you know, I think just to kind of get back to the technology aspect, like, you know, even with the blue light glasses, like you're still getting some stimulation. It's not decreasing or getting rid of all of it.
It's not a magic here.
You know, so when we look at that, like just what the stimulation from technology does is it stimulates the brain, making the brain think that we're actually still in day. And so then the brain's like, I'm not ready for bed. Like, it's still daylight out because I'm still getting that stimulation. And this is where, you know, for adults also, that it becomes a problem because it's one of those that, you know, kids may be on their phone until, you know, they go to bed, but guarantee most adults are too.
Yeah.
They're
Guilty.
checking emails or, you know, they're on social media because the kids are in bed now and I'm going to go on there. And it's not to say that we can't do that, but it's just, you know, in moderation. But also if we're having sleeping issues, like that's probably one of the biggest things that we should also look at.
It's a good place to look. Yeah.
And, you know, that's constantly creating that brain to be stimulated and just then connecting to, you know, maybe our kid actually has trouble of actually shutting down. And where that comes in with chiropractic is that if our brain is constantly overwhelmed and we're stuck in that state of stress, and constantly the body just doesn't want to shut down fully, well, chiropractic helps by, you know, really starting to balance that nervous system so that our kids or ourselves can actually shut down at night and not be still stuck in what we call more that sympathetic stress response, which with everything in our world, in our life, we're constantly stimulated. And if we're not doing anything to counterbalance that stimulation that's coming in, it is going to impact our nervous systems over time and create us to be stuck into that state of stress. And maybe it is sleeping issues, maybe it's digestive issues, maybe it's, you know, just overall anxiety and that stuff that is, you know, presenting from accumulation of stress on that nervous system. But making sure that nervous system is functioning to its best so that, you know, when you do even a lot of these things, like their bodies are going to be able to adapt to those situations so much more in that situation. So it's one of those of like, it's a multifaceted, like these are all great things that we all should be doing too, but chiropractic is something also because we need to make sure that if we are actually falling asleep, that we're actually getting restful sleep too. You know, there's a difference. Like, you know, I have parents that say my kid falls asleep right away, but like they're tired when they wake up in the morning. And but they don't wake up throughout the night. But it's, you know, there's a difference of actually like sleeping for 12 hours and actually getting 12 hours of sleep, like restful sleep. So, and that comes back to that brain just not fully shutting down. And that can be from the constant stimulation and stress that's on the nervous system. So,
and I think that's a really great way for families to kind of see how that looks different. So for me, a vast majority of the time when it is kind of a foundational component that's missing or a behavioral thing that we just need to make sure we're being consistent in our responses, once the child figures that out, they do wake up and they're rested and they're a completely different child. But if you have a situation like this where it's like, okay, they are going to bed on their own, they're sleeping, they're doing great, but they just don't seem rested, that may be a time to check out some other things.
So, you know, there's always different approaches to do it, and it may be, you know, that we just, you know, is it technology? Is it stress on that nervous system? What components, like what are they, you know, what are they eating right before bed? Are they loading up with sugar? Like we have to look at all these things that are stimulus to the nervous system and to the body and, you know, make those changes if need be onto it. So, so let's get into the fourth foundation, which is independent sleep habits. I know you've kind of elaborated somewhat on what you're going to be already talking on here, but so let's get into that one.
So this is the one, this is kind of our biggie. This is what everyone thinks of when they think of the term sleep training, right? So unfortunately, there is this term out there of cry it out. That's what everyone thinks of when they think of sleep training, which technically cry it out is not even an actual method. And so it can have a lot of ambiguity to it. So I really kind of want to break down, why is sleep training needed? When is it needed? And what are we actually doing here? What's our goal? So foundation number 4 is falling asleep independently. And what that means is we are not using any external support for your child to fall asleep. Now, kind of like I said, the big ones we see are nursing or feeding a bottle or bouncing to sleep. That's kind of where it starts. And so, but it can also be as subtle as with our young babies using things like DockATots or you know, kind of that external support in their crib, which is not recommended from a safe sleep perspective anyway, but also from the perspective that it's creating something your child needs to fall asleep. That may be putting a pacifier back in the mouth 50,000 times a night.
Yes.
So it can be subtle too. It can be things like even getting drowsy while you're going through that pre-sleep routine is actually an external support to fall asleep, because drowsiness is the first phase of sleep. So if you've got a child that maybe you say, well, yeah, we give him a bottle right before we put him in his crib, but he's still awake. And, you know, he goes into his bed awake, his eyes are open. Yeah. Well, if he was starting to get sleepy, droopy eyes, or starting to get even a little bit drowsy during that process, that's still an external support to help him into the sleep process. And what happens is whatever our babies or our children have when they fall asleep, they need that every time they awaken. So, you know, that's another thing you hear is, well, babies aren't meant to sleep all night. Well, no, they're not. Adults don't either. Yeah. But we don't wake up and, you know, yell out for our spouse or whatever that is. We just roll over and go back to sleep. And that's where that independent component comes in. So babies are supposed to naturally transition through sleep cycles, both during naps and throughout the night. The difference is when they fall asleep on their own, when they don't need external support to fall asleep, then when they do naturally kind of go through those brief awakenings in the night, they're able to go right back to sleep and don't need to call out for mom or dad to come in. And so whatever they have when they fall asleep, that's what they need every time they go through one of those brief awakenings. And so that's when we hear them crying out and they won't calm down till they're fed. Well, that's because they were fed when they fell asleep, or whatever that looks like. So this is kind of our big component. And the reason why we need that independent sleep component is for that reason, that when they naturally go through those cycles, they can't connect them, and then their sleep is completely broken. Then you're messing with all the development that's happening, the healing that's happening, all of that really important stuff that happens when they have restorative sleep. And so that's why we do sleep training. And there can be all these pretty terms for it: sleep shaping, sleep coaching. We're you know, it's all the same thing. We're letting a baby have some time and space, or a child, depending on how old we are. You're never too late. But we're giving that child the time and space to learn to fall asleep without external support. And, you know, I always tell my families there's no such thing as a no-cry solution. Mm-hmm. You know, we go through phases of life that our children get mad, right? So they may get mad when they're a little bitty and they don't want to be in the car seat, but we still have to go to the grocery store. Yes. When they're older, they don't want you to put the buckles on, or they don't like their socks a certain way, but we still have to do it, right? So sleep is just another one of those things. Like they're crying because it's their only method of communication. They don't have words yet to tell you. They're just frustrated that you're not doing what you used to do. You used to feed them to sleep. Mm-hmm. You used to come pick them up. You used to do whatever, and you're not doing it anymore. And they're telling you they don't like it. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, you know, we know we're making this decision for the betterment of their sleep and their health. So it's just another one of those decisions we have to make as parents, that this is really hard. For the time that we're doing this process, it's really, really hard. And, you know, I tell my families, usually my moms, if you weren't telling me this was going to be hard and scary, I'd be a little bit worried. Mm-hmm. Like, exactly. You know, we love our kids and we don't like to see them upset, but it's just another one of those things that we have to guide them into. And so the difference that I tell my families is there's not a way to completely change an expectation for our children and not have them be upset about it. Yeah. But we can be more or less present. So there's options. There's different methods I talk through with all of my families, and there's options where we may stay present the whole time and not leave the room. There may be options where we leave the room and we don't return. And all of this, the decision making of how present you are, has multiple factors. It's parent comfort level with crying, because sometimes it's just something that's like, mm-hmm. I just cannot not be there for even a check-in or something. And that's fine. That those processes just take a little bit longer if you're more present. We also have to consider the child's temperament and personality. Some are very stimulated if mom and dad are in there often when they're trying to fall asleep, and it's actually counterproductive. And for some, it's really helpful. You know, we need to factor in, are there siblings? So If there's only one parent at home doing a bedtime routine, that parent can't sit in the room the whole time and have, you know, a 3-year-old sibling running around the house free, whatever that looks like.
Yep.
So we kind of have to individualize for the family. But the big picture is how much you're present as your child is getting the time and space to learn that process and learn how to fall asleep without something else supporting them through that.
Yeah, and that's I think very important. So I think those are all very important concepts on that. You know, to talk a little bit, you know, before we jumped on here, one thing we were talking about was, you know, there's people out there, parents that may have heard, you know, well, if I let my kid cry it out, I'm going to traumatize them and that. So you want to kind of just talk a little bit.
And this is a sensitive conversation because, like I said, we as parents love and adore our children and never want to see them appear harmed or anything like that. But there is absolutely no research that shows any sort of really short or long-term negative consequences of a period of time of increased crying as they're learning this process. So this is something that, you know, your child is not crying for hours on end, for weeks on end. If that's happening, we're missing something.
There's probably something else going on.
Yes, I might need to send you to Dr. Eric, but you know, that's not a common response. Usually it's 1 to 3, maybe 4 nights, depending on the method chosen, that you're really having that burst of crying. And so in the grand scheme of things, that's a really short amount of time. And actually, that is probably less detrimental than the weeks, months, years on end of chronic sleep deprivation. So basically, what I often see in, you know, these blog posts or articles that go around is that, you know, the child is releasing a stress hormone. They're releasing cortisol because they're stressed out by this crying and you not responding in the way they want. So I don't want to say not responding because sometimes my parents are present, but they're not picking the child up and feeding them like they used to. And so when we consider that, yes, that is a very brief spike in a cortisol response. It's shown that that does happen, but that's a brief time, and you're also responding to your child and taking care of your child all throughout the day. Your child is being fed, your child is being snuggled and loved and changed. You know, they're not neglected all the time. And I believe there is one study that's out there that's kind of old, but it was done on, you know, children that were in a foreign country and an orphanage, you know, that weren't getting that interaction and loving response from their parents or even their childcare workers that do take care of them during the day. And so that's a very different situation. So what we see is, yes, there is this brief spike, but it can actually be healthy because it's teaching them how to handle a stressful response that is limited and in a protected environment versus if we actually look at, like I said, weeks, months, years of chronic sleep deprivation, the same hormone is released when they're overtired. So as I mentioned earlier, that wave, when they hit that peak and they go into overtiredness, cortisol is one of the hormones released. So if they're constantly overtired and not getting enough sleep, their body is literally always being exposed to that same hormone. And hormones are one of those things, like, it's not different based on what's causing it. It's a hormone that's released from the glands, and that's it. So, you know, I try to comfort my families that have very real concerns that it's not, that it's not something they want to put their child through, or however you want to say that actually it's a very short-term stress response with a massive long-term gain versus a long-term stress response from being chronically overtired. So it can feel scary, especially when there are, you know, very opinionated people out there that have different points of view. And, you know, I tell my families, like, it's okay, like, to be nervous about that. It's okay to be uncomfortable about it. But if we can see the big picture of, we are doing this for your child, not to your child. I tell every family that, like, you know, you're doing this because you know sleep is important. I don't think there's any parent that's going to say my kid doesn't need to sleep well.
Exactly.
It's just, how do we get to that process? And so just encouraging them that this is maybe a week to 2 weeks, maybe 3 if we're having a very parent involved method to have literal lifelong benefits.
Well, and it's like, it's good to see that the parent is worried or about that, because that shows that you care and that stuff. And,
yes.
You want to figure out, what is best for your kid. Like you said, we all know sleep is very important, because when we don't, as parents or adults, don't get sleep, it ruins our day. So it's kind of one of those of like, what's that doing to our kids? And, sleep is one of those, like you mentioned, like if they're not getting that restful sleep, that's like, every night, plugging your phone in and only recharging to, 75%. Like
day in and day out.
Your body's going to drain faster. Just like your cell phone's going to drain faster. So it's one of those that we need to make sure that that's our time to recharge. So we need to make sure that we're getting, the amount of hours, but that we're also getting restful sleep, on that. So like you mentioned, if they're going and, this process is taking longer and they're just, that crying is going for weeks and that stuff. Well, what else is going on?
Yeah, that's not a typical
most likely they're constantly repeating a stressful response.
Right.
And that could have, that could be an indication that there's something going on deeper that we need to look at. And that's where, chiropractic would come into play. But it's like, looking at all these different aspects and really making sure that, it's not just one piece of the puzzle. Like you said, it's not just one thing that you're going to have to do and everything's going to change. Like it could be that we need to change, 10 of these things, all these 4 foundational components, but there may be to a chiropractic neurological component too, or it's like getting rid of technology, or, eliminating the sweets right before bed.
Yeah.
Like all of these different things, I think that's the biggest stress is like, we're so busy already in life that it's like, I have to do all of these things to like get that. Isn't there just one thing, and that's too kind of like how our society's been trained is like, well, it's just, let's just give them this and they'll make them sleep. Like, well, is it in the best interest long term for them onto that? Or yes, it's kind of the hard, easy approach. It's going to be hard in the beginning, but it's going to get easier and it's going to be the best instead of trying to struggle through it the rest of time.
And like you mentioned with me, you were telling me a little bit about your son and your habits, and you're like, we don't even think twice about it anymore. We've just always done it this way, so it just becomes what you do. And adults, like I mentioned earlier, we have routines too. So eventually your kids' routines just fall right into line. It's kind of like exercise, right? Like we can crash diet and lose a few pounds and then it always comes back. Like, would you rather that or put in that kind of work in the beginning and just make it a habit that we see the benefits last a lot longer?
Yeah. It's all about lifestyle habits and changes and that stuff, because it isn't just make a change here and then, see some benefits and then go right back to lifestyle or go right back to what we were doing, because most likely that's what got us here in the first place. And so many different aspects of life.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing with sleep. It's going to be a routine thing because, we have busy lives. We get that there's, like you mentioned, there's some parents that work until, 6:30. Both of them say they get home at 6:30 and they want to spend some time with their kid. But it's like, is that in the best interest of their kid especially during such a crucial developmental?
Right. Yeah.
And
remembering that it lasts for a time.
Yes.
It's not something that you're gonna be having that same struggle years down the road. It's okay during this time when we really need to prioritize sleep. They're really going through a lot of development. But that's just where we need to be for this season. Yeah.
Well, so and exactly. I think that just covers a lot of that basis, and that's where I would say, if you have a kiddo out there that is struggling, and there's so many different aspects of, sleep. It could be that they're struggling with trying to fall asleep, or they constantly need, that, external stimuli to try to help them get to sleep, or, they're constantly waking up, but they're going to sleep fine, but, they like actually just wake up multiple times throughout the night. There's so many different things that could be impacted in the sleep. So if you have a kiddo, or maybe even yourself, I know you work with what certain ages?
Generally about 5 and under, 5, 6 and under.
Yeah. So, if you have a kiddo that is 5 and under, or, even reach out to me on some things too. It's just, if your kiddo is struggling with sleep, we need to get that addressed and, start getting better sleeping habits. Or if there is a neurological component, that's why we do the scans in our office, so we can really know what's going on and really address those. So you can reach out to us at the clinic by either just direct messaging us or giving us a call. But what's the best way if a parent wanted to reach out to you?
Yeah, so my website is likeadreamconsulting.com, or email is info@likeadreamconsulting.com, and that's really the best place to get me. Okay. I do have Facebook. You can contact me through there, but email is just where everything kind of funnels, just one place, and I don't get lost in it. So yeah, and there's a contact page on the website. So if you just go to the website, fill out the contact page, that'll come to my email, and we can get started. One thing I do offer is a free 15-minute introductory call. So most families choose to go that route, and that gives me a chance to kind of, I will ask you for just like a brief, give me the big picture overview of what we're struggling with, and then I can kind of help guide you on which support package I think is going to be most beneficial. This is not a time that I'm going to give you any, mind-blowing information, but it just helps me kind of guide, like, oh, I think we probably need a week, or I think we probably need 2 weeks, or maybe we can do this less involved package, different things, but kind of help guide you and answer any questions about what exactly I do looks like, what does support looks like, what kind of methods do we use, things like that. That's a good time to get those questions out so that you feel comfortable making the decision to go ahead and, opt for a support package. Yeah.
And I'll make a comment in the comments section with your contact information onto that, so it kind of makes it so you don't have to try to remember to write this down. I'll have that in the comments section. But I want to thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Talking more about these different patterns and different foundational components to help kids, and just these are probably some things that adults could just do themselves. So it's not just one age group. So
no, it's not. No. So much is beneficial to all of us. Yeah.
So, well, thank you so much, and thank you everyone that joined us. And just keep an eye for future webinars on just a bunch of different topics that we'll be covering going forward. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.